But the idea for this show was to actually raise a lot of questions while also looking at really fascinating works by people who propose alternative systems for understanding the world we live in. It wasn't a show just of artists, but these were people with theories about the world. Some of them considered themselves to be urbanists, architects. Some were more closely related to alternative medicine. There were people who proposed alternative systems of tracking time, alternative calendar systems, but there were also people who were inventing time machines and alternative technologies, alphabets, and also two alternative fringe physics guys from California. This was just sort of the first room you walked into, and it's George Widener, whose work is on the left, and these are some works by Alfred Jensen, who's the outsider in the exhibition because he's sort of an insider. He was an autodidact, especially in terms of his philosophical beliefs. And he himself saw his work as actually making concrete proposals about ways of thinking about time, mixing up in ways that nobody else would really mix up. Mayan calendars, Pythagorean mathematics, systems like the I Ching, and Goethe's theory of color, which, unlike color appearing on a kind of spectrum, it's all about colors as being in opposition to each other. So he was a completely conceptual painter. I mean, the color relationships are not something he's working out visually. It's all based on a system. So George is a calendar savant, and he just sees numbers almost like the way we see three-dimensional objects around us. He often works in magic squares, where the columns and the diagonals, the numbers all add up to the same number. But there are also lots of other numerical games that he plays inside the works. But George also constructs time machines. He sees himself as a time traveler with what he does. And he's someone who believes in the singularity, the idea that machines will become intelligent. And so he's making his art for a future audience of intelligent machines. He puts numerical puzzles in there, which he thinks will amuse the machines in the future. These are some more drawings by George Widener, who also overlays his interest in time and calendars on these very detailed kind of megalopolis landscapes, where you really have space and time kind of utterly interwoven. And a lot of these dates will be dates that fall all on the same day. George is also really interested in historical coincidences. There's a lot of work in this show by people who want to redesign cities, redesign buildings. Jan Gluzak, who briefly went to architecture school, had a kind of schizophrenic breakdown, but kept making theoretical paper architecture, actually won a major Polish prize in the mid-70s and represented Poland at the Venice Biennale in the later 70s. A lot of projects were for distressed landscapes. I mean, he was imagining an Earth that would be utterly polluted, and he was figuring out how people could survive in that. And this is someone working in the 60s and early 70s. He developed a type of window that would operate like an eyelid in response to the sun, and even had eyelashes. He also had a kind of utopian vision of a utopian city called Humanopolis. And a lot of his work was actually based on forms in nature. You know, it's interesting to me that there are a lot of similarities with avant-garde architectural groups like Archigram or Super Studio. Because really, their work was just as fantastical as Jan's. And so, you know, this idea of who's an outsider, it's just a question that so much of this work, I think, brings up. Also, a would-be city builder is Bodhisattva Kingles, who lives in Kinshasa in the Congo. And he's been engaged in this project since the late 80s, which he calls architectural modelism, where he creates these amazing models of buildings, all of which are often specific places: a sports complex in Mongolia, a pavilion for Hiroshima, a train station in Palestine. I mean, it's a very modernist point of view. He really believes that architecture would change people's behavior. And I think one of the things that's also fascinating me at Williams' project, I mean, super popular, obviously, are Williams' amazing portraits of people who would live in Praise Frisco, his reimagined future version of San Francisco. That's a very wholesome, gospel-inflected kind of future city. But is that he's working out not only what the bigger picture looks like, but he's doing floor plans for the actual houses he's proposing, that it's this concrete, where you get into something that feels more like something practical than something that's just artistic. And it's that engagement with a proposition that feels quite concrete, which interested me in this kind of work. And one of the things that you'll notice sooner or later in this presentation is that a lot of this work takes the form of diagrams or architectural engineering, architectural blueprints. It's very different from the kind of outsider art that is represented in the canon, which is more, seems like it's growing out of a psychic reality. It might be gestural or very highly repetitive. Now, the only person to show who actually